here. So hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. I'm excited today to be joined by one of the pillars of this little corner, Paul Vanderklay. This conversation as background, I come into this little corner by means of Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau, and then John Vervaeke has become one of the fundamental influences in my life in a lot of ways. And so I hadn't engaged your work too much until more recently, actually, as a function of starting this channel. Some people connected with me through the John Vervaeke conversations that I've had, and it's been really lovely. But kind of because of that, I've started to watch some of your videos and really enjoyed obviously just getting to know you kind of through this virtual means. And then we had an exchange on Twitter, or a little bit of an exchange by means of some other folks in the corner, about this whole notion of what do we mean by the word Christianity. And so that's kind of the direction I want to head, and I'll lay a little bit of background so you kind of understand my question. But
okay,
welcome to Climbing on Mount Sophia, and thank you so much for coming.
that's good to be here.
So I guess I'll just jump right into it. Because probably everyone who watches my channel they know who you are. So I've been having this struggle, and there's two different aspects of this question. One is like, what does it mean to call yourself a Christian in kind of an existential sense? Like, there's that whole question, and I'm interested in getting into that. But first, I'd like to ask a little bit of a different question, which is, since engaging with John's work, it's become really important to me not to equivocate the words I'm using. And for me, that really lays itself out in terms of when I am trying to articulate something and even just understand my own experience of the world. If I use the same word to mean the same thing every time, it's stable for me. And then that gets even more significant in conversation with others. And so I'm running up over and over again against this term Christian and Christianity. And it strikes me as it's so terrifically equivocated that I've kind of stopped using it, but it's still like you're forced to use it. And so I'm trying to grapple with, like, how do I use this term in this language to refer to this like behemoth of a thing,
Right.
But anyway. So that's my issue.
I didn't hear a question. I see your reality. I see the problem, and to see the problem says a lot of good things about you, because in some ways, for Christians, Christianity is reality. Like, Christ is reality. You know, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. So Jesus, you have kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God in the synoptics. You have eternal life in John. And then you have in Christ in a lot of the Pauline literature. And so you're quite right when, and this is where some of the work of Tom Holland is helpful, because, his backstory, he was left the church at 6 years old or something, and just got a university degree, was interested in history, wanted to be a great writer, started writing vampire novels. That didn't really do it. So then he wrote Rubicon, which is, he loved dinosaurs. He loved the classical world. And the more he studied the classical world, the more he began to feel the distance between the present world and the classical world. And then he wrote this book on Islam, and Islam's basically Islam's creation story of Islam itself. And there's a lot of historical issues with that. I mean, people think there are issues with the origin story of Christianity. Just compare it with Islam. It's not even close. And so then he starts going on the road promoting his book, and really annoyed a lot of Muslims. And one guy finally said to him, why don't you study your own religion? He's like, well, I don't have a religion. And then he writes this book, and he begins to realize that the Western world, and to a degree, any place that's been impacted by secularity, is deeply, deeply formed by Christianity. And even the even those pushing back against it. I mean, this is what Peterson was pointing to when he, the atheist, he would say to the atheist, you're not really an atheist. And of course they'd get all offended.
It's a sect of Christianity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Atheism is sort of the secret second sister to the church. And so what does that mean in terms of this word Christian? Who is a Christian? And especially because you have all of, so I'm going to talk to John and Jordan B. Cooper this week. And I was listening to Jordan B. Cooper's critique of John again, and just thinking about how these issues are so difficult to untie and unpack. And, John, with his interest and pursuit of Neoplatonism, this stuff has been together for so long. I mean, Augustine, was Manichaean for a while, then deeply Neoplatonic. I was talking to Al Walters once on this listserv, and he was talking about, one of his interests in Augustine is his Neoplatonism. And, John making the observation of the deep connections between Aquinas and Platonism. And some people have said, Christianity is Platonism for the masses. So there's no getting around Christianity almost anywhere in the world, even places that want to be ostensibly secular and anti-Christian. And so, yeah, the term is tremendously fraught, which, and then just in common use, well, are you a Christian? Well, what do you mean by that? As someone who lives in Saudi Arabia, everyone in America is Christian, except for maybe a few Muslims and Jews. But everyone else, all the atheists are Christian. And they've got a point. So what then does it mean in American terms, to be a Christian? And when you're in church, you have this in depth, because a lot of what churches do is tell people who are ostensibly Christian or self-identify as Christian to say, you're not a good real Christian. You should be a better Christian, a more real Christian. It just, there's no end to this dilemma.
Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing you say is, like, you want to make, like, Christianity is this thing that underlies, it's like this operating system that a whole, like, everything we know of as culture, and I agree with this version, is like there's and it's embedded in the grammar, as John likes to say. It's so deeply embedded in the strains of thoughts that we all stand on, and even the strange ways in which it's fully self-critical of itself. It's still standing on itself to start with. So like, and that's the way that it's like this collective form of ideas almost that's running on this. But then on the flip side, so there's that thing that's happening, and then there's all the layers that stack up off of that with all their distortions and things. But then on the other side, you have this, okay, individual identifying with this thing,
right? Which
gets like, so all these layers on either side, there's mismatches, and it gets totally confusing in that way. Does that seem like?
Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason why if you look at the 1970s, so I laugh every time someone complains about Christian nationalism, because that has been the default position of the United States from its inception, even though, I mean, deism is a strain of Christianity. You have all of this. So then in the 1970s, you had this born again movement, and Jimmy Carter was so-called first born again president. Chuck Colson, after, he had been Richard Nixon's hatchet man, and he meets somebody in Washington who starts talking to him about Jesus. And he basically, in his book, Born Again, comes home and tells his wife that, he's a Christian now. And she's sort of like, I thought we were Episcopalian. And so I think part of the reason all of that personal relationship language emerged in the late 20th century was an attempt to differentiate the lived existential participatory thing that then, evangelical churches in particular called a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, with sort of the Episcopalian mainline background noise that was pervasive in American culture. And so then what a lot of evangelicals did, and you see Catholics do it, and I think that's part of what we see with people who are becoming Orthodox and this all movement. They're appropriating it, they're making it something their own, and so because they have to gain some distance from the background noise. I mean, you could call that in some ways a degree of self-transcendence, but it also has to be personal. So, I've looked at the first so is John's stuff coming out today? Yeah, it's coming out today.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I looked
excited.
at I got a sneak peek at the first one.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the stuff that he wants to do, the participatory, the procedural, all of that stuff, we didn't use those fancy words in some evangelical church someplace. They called it a personal relationship with Jesus, but that's the functional equivalent. They needed to make Jesus participatory, procedural, perspectival, and not just propositional. And that's why that emerges in the evangelical church.
Yeah, it's almost like, so I guess before I had talked about the overall historical level of the ideas of Christianity, and then you have the persons, but there's this other thing, right, which is what Christianity is in itself, which is something like the person of Christ, right, and a means of participating in reality, such that the theosis idea, such that you're in communion with reality as it's supposed to be, and you're it's no longer I that live, but Christ that lives in me. And so that thing in itself, it's almost, I guess the way I see it is like there's the thing in itself, and then there's all of us and our various positioning or posturing in relation to that thing. And based on that is where we get the kind of historical overlay of what Christianity comes to be. And because it's so vast and because it's so significant, we get this massive confusion, because there's just like the number of postures held in relation to this thing bleeds out this historical framework that is just, and cultural framework that's very, very like bizarre and confusing at this point.
I think the quest for the thing in itself is analogous to what I've called a monarchical vision. We want, and I think it's sort of sneakily, once again, an attempt to distill Christianity or almost anything else into the propositional. You will never, I do not think our little brains or even our little traditions can capture the thing in itself. And that's, I think that's recognized by various theological statements that are both Protestant and Orthodox or Roman Catholic. When we talk about God not being knowable, it doesn't mean that we can't know anything, but we cannot contain God. And so every time we have this quest for the thing in itself, that's just, to me, another version of the same game of propositional capturing. And I think the motivation for that is, if we think we can capture, well, how would we capture it? Probably propositionally within an abstracted box. If we think we can capture the thing in itself, then we can wield it. And I think fundamental to Christianity and fundamental to anything that is not idolatrous is it cannot be wielded. You cannot wield God. And I think idolatry is fundamentally the attempt to wield God through a statue, through a practice, through a set of propositional beliefs. If I do these things, then it's idolatrous, because we then want to replace God. And fundamentally, the posture you need to have towards God is not idolatrous. It is, I can't even know my wife in herself, or my children in herself, or my church in itself. And so to sort of say, well, I want to really define Christianity in itself, That's nothing you are capable of by virtue of who you are.
Yes, absolutely. Because, well, I mean, that's the move of original sin already, right? But it's abstracted up. Like you're taking the original sin thing that you can do just in yourself, in the world, which is, to predicate your belief of what reality is on your own reference point. And then you're abstracting that up a whole nother layer to the layer of the religious.
Right.
And you're doing it and then projecting it in a way. And in a way, it gets more and more powerful over time. Right.
Right.
But every time that happens, there's a, it's almost like there's a cascading effect of negative space that's created in the world because of that sin, right? Like that's a sin, but it's a high level sin because it throws off a whole thread, and then everybody downstream of that thread is like missing, like they're missing a whole ability to reference frame.
But yeah, the first 3 commandments: I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make a graven image. And that, I mean, I think people don't realize the revolutionary nature of that commandment. And that commandment isn't merely the commandment to don't make a little statue. That's the specific manifestation of it. But even Protestants who are iconoclastic can violate that commandment in a sense by saying they capture God. No, and that's why you worship God. You don't capture God because you can't. And if there's anything that you should learn from reading the Bible, in my opinion, is that the posture you have towards God has to be one of a servant, one of a receiver, one of a worshiper, not one of a master. When you and we subtly slip into that role all the time.
And it's so easy to do, right? It's so pernicious because it's always the third commandment of Jesus that, at least for me, right? It's the temptation of virtue that gets you, right? It's that moment where I'm like, I need to defend this virtue because this is threatening it, and I'm going to use the Bible to do it.
That's right.
And it's like, now you're in charge of making the thing happen. And it's like, now, well, you're not doing the thing anymore.
Right. And, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that fear, I mean, sometimes it can be, afraid. Sometimes it can be reverent awe, but fundamental in that is recognizing the asymmetry of the relationship from the beginning. And many religious traditions get that. But it is tremendously difficult to maintain it. You need a religious tradition because obviously you really can't live on nothingness. And even once you say, well, I live on nothingness, well, there's your dogma. I mean, you need something,
right.
But and so you have to maintain a posture of obedience, submission, reverence, worship.
Yeah, it's like you can scale that up, right? It can be scaled up in the way that we can abstract out these layers of the thing and put them into things like dogma, but they're only used as dogma pointing upward, if that makes sense, right? Like as soon as they turn around and point downward, it becomes the inverse of Christ's. The first will be last and the last will be first, and he who is greatest must be servant of all. It's like, if as soon as you start enforcing this dogma top down instead of using it as like, hey, this is a way if you want to come up, like those are different things.
They are. Think about it analogous to, let's say, are you married? Okay, a relationship. Do you have kids?
I have a 10-week-old.
Oh, well, you're just getting started.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you know a lot about your wife. She's and yet she's a mystery to you. Both of those things are true.
Yeah.
And so I've been married 35 years, and I know you might be able to make an argument that I know my wife better than you know yours, just because we've been together longer. But when you say it, though, you begin to, if you say it and you think about it, you begin to realize how fraught even that statement is.
Yep.
Because I'm continuing to change. She's continuing to change. what's amazing is that after 35 years, there's some things that, I can is she going to like this? Is she not going to like this? And then now I've got 5 children. I've got 5 adult children. Let's say one of them comes to me and says, I'm thinking about doing this for mom. What do you think? So it runs both ways. There is dogma with respect to my wife.
Sure.
But even the dogma, I mean, you can't even contain my wife with the dogma, much less the creator God. So, but there can be things to know, and there's information and knowledge that you can pass along. I mean, all those things are true. It's just, we do have to continue to realize our limits. But even so, let's say you do something and your wife doesn't like it and you thought she would, then it's like, well, didn't you know? And it's like, did I know? Didn't I know? I mean, did I really want to give this thing to you because I wanted to give it to you? Or was I thinking, it's, and
it didn't show up for me.
That's right. And we have this all the time just with other people. And so psychologists will talk about projection and, transference, countertransference. I mean, it's enormously complex, even just with other human beings.
Yes.
And even with simpler creatures like dogs and cats, we certainly know our dogs and cats better than we know our spouses or our children or our coworkers. But the art of knowing is no simple thing.
Yes. So thank you. That's phenomenal. And so I want to take all of this that we've just built is this is fundamental to this thing that we mean of Christianity that we're trying to participate in. Right. And I want to try to talk about that with people. My difficulty is I often try to talk about that with people, and what they see is literally the opposite of what we just talked about. They see a repressive system that's engendered, difficult things into the world. And that's a particular viewpoint of it through all these distortions. And that's that. I don't mean to say anything about what that is in terms of its content, but I'm just how do we talk about these in a way that we don't spend all the time just trying to pull apart, I don't mean what you think of as Christianity. I'm trying to talk about something different. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And part of the reason in my channel, what I spend a lot of time doing with is just people's stories, because I mean, talk about one of the things that I said this morning, I listened to Rosaria Butterfield talking to Beckett Cook. And so you've got 2 individuals, both who had lived, very gay lifestyles, and both of whom had pretty dramatic transformations. And it was Rosaria Butterfield's, her story's pretty famous now. But, when you listen to her tell her story, it's just a story. Mm-hmm. And now she's got a whole bunch of other, she's been writing books, and she's got a whole bunch of other messages that she's sending out. She's got a particular, you can sort of place her in a particular bucket of Christians in terms of a whole bunch of things. Fair enough. But the story, there's a level to reality that stories capture, and it's a very durable layer. It's not perfect, but it's a very durable layer. And usually, again, what we want to do is give people deliverables, where, and again, what is a deliverable? It's usually procedural, or it's propositional. It's an abstraction that you can just apply to your life. And that's completely human. It's totally well and good. We should all make use of the deliverables around us. But I'd back off of Christianity and using that word, because once you use that word, people, we're just right there with people. And it's back off the word and tell the story. And again, even even the New Testament phrase, I mean, be ready to share with people the hope that is within you. That's a very story oriented, and it's automatically, it's all four P's right away. It's perspectival, it's procedural, it's participatory. What hope do you have within you? It was interesting in her talk with Beckett. She was talking about the fact, so she was a university professor, I think, in University of Syracuse. She was a tenured professor in English literature and gender studies, and she was basically going to write a book about these horrible evangelical Christians. But she's a serious scholar and a researcher, so she decides to research, and she got all kinds of letters from hate mail and love mail from people on different sides of the gender fight. And she got one more particularly interesting letter from a pastor, and she just began a relationship with him. And one of the things that she noted was that in her religious context, everything was political, and it was all about politics and activism. And they lived and died on that hill emotionally. And one of the things that really impressed her was that clearly these conservative, reformed people that she was dealing with had strong views of all sorts of things, but they didn't live and die in their politics or their activism or anything. They were living and dying in Christ, and that meant a certain amount of freedom from the ups and downs of, and you can apply this to churches, the ups and downs of Sunday morning attendance, the ups and downs of the YouTube algorithm, the ups and downs of all of these things, because your life is hidden. Your life is hidden in Christ, and you know that all these other things are going to happen. So what you can really share with people is you. That's the most real thing you have to share with them. And you're going to have ideas and abstractions. I also often note that, obviously in Christian circles, let's say you look at the Apostle Paul. If the Apostle Paul was walking around today, what opinions would he have about all sorts of things? The truth is they'd be all over the map. And perhaps some of the people who count themselves the greatest followers of the teachings and writings of the Apostle Paul, he might hate their guts. They're just living in totally different realms, because we take these things, we have to abstract them, we have to build models, we have to build systems. None of that is bad or wrong or anything, but there's an unrealness about it that is, you are more real than that. And so what you should actually share is you, to the best you can. It's remarkably difficult. Because even just look at Jesus. He spends 3 years. And one of the things, so when I was in college, I grew up in a minister's home, went to college, went to a Christian college, but did think to myself, I should just read this Bible and, what do I think of this Bible? And, I had read stuff in the Bible before. I'd been to church all my life, but I started reading it as a young college student thinking, this book is strange. You'd think, given the Dutch Calvinist stuff that I'm looking at, that you'd think it would look more like a catechism, or it would look like a tome of systematic theology. And then you've got Jesus walking around, and, they're having fights about, healing on Sunday, and he has all these crazy sayings, and it's like, this is truly strange.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's still, changing people. Well, what's with that? It just goes from there.
Yeah. I guess, like, this is kind of, this is tying together a bunch of things for me with the way you said that, because it's been really important to me to learn about some of the Neoplatonic stuff, and especially D.C. Schindler's book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, and starting to get this sense of the ascent and return in the cave, and the world of ideas and the world of appearances and all these kinds of things. But it's like, almost one of the things I'm seeing in what you're saying is that you have to, like, use the appropriate medium for the level you're dealing with. And it's like narrative is the appropriate medium for narrative trauma. If we're going to be if we're going to be participating with the world in such a way as to bring the gospel, the good news of redemption into it, which means something very real and embodied, if we're going to do that, we might, like, I needed to get clear about the ideas, right? I needed to go out of the cave so that the idea, the thing in itself became clear to me. And it became clear to me that it was not me, and it was not in relation to me. I was in relation to it. And then if you're going to go back down and you're going to, like, say participate the enactment of forgiveness, like, that is, like, what that means is agape. That means agape on the level of the individual narrative, where what connects to people, what connects us all to each other, is the subversion in that happens when the narrative is engaged with agape, because the narrative level only resolves with forgiveness through agape, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if you look at, say, something like forgiveness, let's say, oh, I'm going to learn about forgiveness. You can go to Amazon and find the top books, in, because Amazon likes all these little micro rankings, you know, top book in forgiveness.
Yeah.
you can read that book
categories, right?
Right. You can read that book and not learn anything like you would learn if, let's say, someone close to you betrayed you, and what that would call you to. And then what forgiveness looks like. And again, all of this language is an attempt to approximate it, but even just look at the language we would looks like. Looking is a very, receptive enterprise. And that's the Christian life.
Yeah.
That's what you do. It's a, and this is one of the things I appreciate about, what John is trying to do. He's at least recognized that, I love what he said to Jonathan Peugeot about Plato. I mean, the way we taught Plato is just stupid. And it's not that those dialogues are unimportant, and they are important. They've shaped Western history. All that is great. But life is to be lived. And if anything is going to be of any use, then having the painful, difficult thing of having to forgive someone, if someone pays attention to it, is far more instructive than the best book you can find on the Amazon list of forgiveness books.
Yeah. I really appreciate this conversation, because this is actually kind of like, there's a real insight in this for me, because I'm seeing this way in which, like, one of the things I've just been, like, kicking against is this feeling of exclusivity about Christianity. And that's been one of the thorn in my side that's driven me down this whole path. But once I felt like I was able to make peace with the actual idea itself, then I'm trying to figure out how to communicate it, or walk through it. And there's something of, like, this, how John always says, put on my grave neither utopia nor nostalgia.
Yeah.
And I found that to be so helpful as, like, an existential, I use it almost like a koan, because I see in myself, in this way, there's, like, this utopic vision of, like, man, if we could get Christianity right, if you all just could understand it. But
then what? Then what? Tell me.
Exactly. Then we would all just live, right? But, like, just live now, which is always the teaching.
Yeah. You could, and that's a fun exercise to do when you watch someone being, dramatic, either towards disaster or utopia. It's like, okay, what then? And it's, I mean, think about how to be a Christian towards your dog. You can say anything you want to your dog, and they're only going to get 30 words. Okay. What is living the life of Christ towards your pet? What does that look like? It is a life that is lived. And again, we're not going to get away from having to talk about things, have abstractions, have models. We're not going to get away from any of that, because that's a function of, for a certain subset of us. I made a video a few months ago basically, I don't remember the title of it, to the effect of, why, why so often unsophisticated Christians are better Christians. It was something to that fact. If you look at my channel and you search sophisticated, you'd probably find it.
Sure.
But because I saw that, where you got all these smart people who've read a lot of books, and again, I love all this thinky talky stuff. I really do. I need it. I need it for me. I need it for my heart. It's just part of how I'm wired. But I so often see and live amongst Christians that way outperform me. And if you ask them a question about doctrine or dogma, or, anything that's supposedly really important right now in Christianity, whatever the newest fads are all over the map, and they're always fads, they can't tell you a darn thing about it. But you know what they know how to do? They know how to love other people well. And I will take that over a world of really brilliant people who are tremendously well read. Because and that isn't to say that lack of sophistication doesn't sometimes cause trouble, because sometimes those unsophisticated Christians can get duped or blindsided, or, I mean, none of us are infallible, but that that just demonstrates the fact that life is to be lived. That's and there's so much in it that we can't control, and this is in a sense why, this doesn't sound tremendously Protestant. A lot of these words sort of have dual tasks within models, but why there are saints, why there are exemplary Christians among us. And part of the irony is that sometimes people are exemplary Christians in one way, but not another. Mm-hmm. And we can't often tell where those boundaries are. And so we follow these saints, and sometimes they got things right. They got some things right, and they got some things wrong. And we're tended to dismiss them because they got a particular thing wrong. That's just as much a function of our perception of them too, and our value hierarchy. So, but yeah, Christianity is to be lived. Part of the difficulty, especially on YouTube, is that we're looking at each other in this little thin screen, in this little window. What do you know about me? What do I know about you? It's tremendously unreal, but it's better than nothing, apparently, because we're still watching.
Well, it's interesting because, like, when you start off thinking about the ideas, like, for me, it was so important to disentangle so many things that were manifesting in negative ways in my life. Like, for me to become purified or sanctified or whatever necessitated a path through this kind of, call it, intellectual world, where I had to understand what was going on for me with Martin Luther, and I had to understand what was going on for me with Augustine, and I had to understand what was going on for me with Kant and Descartes. Like, once I understood those, then I could start to see. But that, and there's a way in which, like, there is good time to be spent in pulling apart these knots, because if you're able to pull apart the knots in a way that people can hear you, they can now be free of that knot. But, like, Jesus didn't write down his words, neither did Socrates, and neither did Buddha. But they've had those are three of the most outsized effects on the world of all time, because what the being of truth that came through them generated such a field that downstream of it, we could climb into these worlds and build all these, you can build Hegelian philosophy. But I mean, it just sits there, right?
Yep. No, that's right. That's exactly right.
It's a castle in the sky.
Yep. And I'm in the same boat. I wouldn't have, oh gosh, how many hours do I have on YouTube right now? I mean, I do a ton of it, and so much of my channel, it's conversations, or it's me trying to untie knots.
Totally.
And I found, for me, whether it's blogging, I did that earlier before I did this, or it's on YouTube, I find it helpful that's what you do too as a community. You sit around in a circle. Here you got a big knot. We're all going to work on it together.
Yep.
And YouTube is sort of a way that we do that. It's
Yep.
imperfect, but it's better than thinking alone.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, my experience is like, I hope that the content that I put on YouTube is of service to people.
Yeah.
But that's actually not the primary reason I do it. The primary reason I do it is because it helps me get disentangled.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Yep.
Like, I wouldn't be talking to you if it wasn't for this. And this conversation has led to an insight for me. So maybe in some way it's inherently selfish, but I hope it's selfish in the way that it makes me more like Christ and thus makes others like Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so I think, yeah, like it's funny because it's that attitude. It's having that kind of attitude with all the different layers kind of simultaneously. Something like that.
Yeah. 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 And we don't know. So we untie. No, you're exactly right. It's then my channel. I try to explain that to people sometimes because they'll watch my videos and I'll say, gosh, he's rambling. The video's an hour and a half. He didn't get to the point until the end. That's because I didn't know the point until the end. And I
Yeah.
and sometimes I don't know the point until after the end. And I'm thinking about the video and thinking like, gosh, I got to put a title on this thing. What really was I looking for? What insight did I grasp?
Yeah.
And then then I just tell people, if my video is helpful, I'm glad I can share it with you. But if you say I can't sit through all that, I'd say I totally understand. I'm sure I probably couldn't either. So this is just my process. And as long as YouTube is going to give me free bandwidth, okay, I guess
Yeah.
I'll keep doing it.
Yeah.
Because I have found it helpful for me. And the reason that it's helpful is that it is facilitating community.
Mhm.
Because so again, I noticed I was sort of a little bit dismissive of abstraction or implementation or giving someone actionable, but we do need that.
Mhm.
And part of why community works is that I can learn from you, you can learn from me, and others watching us will have other observations. And it's in the book of Proverbs all over the place. I mean,
Yeah.
listen, pay attention. Don't just listen to your friends, listen to your critics. Even listen to your enemies. And if you're humble enough to learn from them, your enemies can bless you.
Mm.
And many wisdom traditions have noted this for a very long time, but doesn't mean it's easy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, at least for me, it's always the return. It's often the return to the the space of abstraction now that allows me to come back to that. And I think that's like, wow, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't want to need to go back there. I want it to be I want to be I want to live in such a way that I don't need to go anywhere else in order to be here, right? And so now it is that way. And so here I am. But yeah.
Well, I think I don't think we should be too embarrassed by going there because when you think about what abstraction is, I did this for a while on a lot of my videos. You've got lower and upper register. Upper register is sort of the world of the mind, and the world of the mind is heaven-like in some ways. There isn't decay, and so going there and visiting there is not a bad thing. It's that human beings are deeply connected between both, and to actually attain it is a good thing. It's just that this world, this up here is it's to serve the lower. It's very
Mm-hmm.
Pageauian. The upper is to serve the lower,
Yeah.
and the lower is to support the upper. And as long as that dynamic is functioning well, it's a very blessed thing. Because
Yeah.
and that's the reason you have the desire to know the thing in and of itself.
Yeah, because really like that's what it means to be in the kingdom of heaven, is to actually have both things coming together at the same time in real life as a real particular person. And that's,
Right.
what it means for the kingdom of heaven to come to earth, I think.
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's right there in the
Yeah.
Lord's Prayer.
Yeah. But it's not some kind of like future abstracted event, right? Like that's, I think, one of the things where we get really tripped up is like, whether it is in the grand narrative or not, I don't know. But like, at least from what it's trying to say to me, what that text, I think, is not suggesting to me is that somewhere in the future, that prayer is asking like Jesus to come back in the sky and judge everyone. But that prayer is actually asking that is realized as a function of my life, not in a totalizing sense, but in the particular being of my life in that day.
I don't know that those things are separable.
Okay. How
because
so?
Well, we so live. So my wife and I are going through this this very interesting series on Hulu. The guy's name Ramy, Ramy. It's about a kid who's grown up in North Jersey, and his parents were Muslim immigrants from Egypt, and he's just trying to figure out if he wants to be Muslim or not, and trying to figure out his life. And there's one episode where it's quite a remarkable series. Different episodes often focus on different family members, and the one episode on his father. His father had lost his job, didn't want to tell his wife, didn't want to tell his family, was getting tremendously stressed out because bills weren't getting paid and all of this stuff. And finally, his son, he blows up at an important family meeting, and his son goes out to him, and his father says to him, I live in the future so that you can live in the present. And I want you and your mom and your sister to all live in the present. I'm going to live in the future. I mean, I'm going to think about the bills. I'm going to think about, and as human beings, as we live in history, we're almost always forward looking and forward leaning. And I often, it's so funny because it becomes a cliche in our culture. We'll live in the moment. And I think, well, like my dog, like the apes in Africa. No, we don't get to do that. We do have to navigate that so that we're not simply living in the future, but the future does orient us. And John was talking about this. The sacred double is different from what I talk about the secret sacred self, because the secret sacred self is a much more Gnostic. It's a sort of Gnosticism that's in our culture, but the divine double, that's what John calls it. Where we are, there's a future you that you want to become. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And in many ways that has to line up, that has to go all the way to the top. And that's what we do with, when we talk about the second coming of the Lord, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. All of that just lines us to the future because we are creatures in time. And I think, especially for us, if we sort of take the skeptical route of saying, oh, I don't know about the second coming of Christ, or I don't know about my participation in the afterlife, I think that sort of cuts us off at our knees, and it doesn't help us sort of orient ourselves properly. I don't think we can actually function without mentally projecting ourselves into this future. I think that's just part and parcel of how we live. And, I know John and Jonathan have gone back and forth on that. And I think they've sort of arrived at a certain detente with that. But I remember Peugeot saying in one of the early conversations, I think it's fair to say that existence isn't itself narrative. And the last conversation that John and Jonathan had, I thought was really good on that. Existence isn't itself narrative, but I don't know that we as human beings can seriously operate without it. And you get that by reading in scripture. Just go through your Bible and try to find all the places that it talks about the life of the age to come. I'm going to use that language because I think it's a little bit sharper than some of the other terms. We have no idea.
Yeah.
Are streets really going to be paved in gold? I mean,
Right.
we don't have any idea. And all of the, the Apostle Paul basically probably talking about himself, caught up into the third heaven, you can't articulate it.
Mm-hmm.
That actually sounds very reasonable. But I think we have to still use our narrative, future leaning orientation to actually achieve the transformations that we're looking for. And part of the reason I believe that is because in watching, let's say, the modernist fundamentalist fight in America, I don't want to discount the modernists, but I think the path of fundamentalism, for all of the pitfalls and things it fell into, actually in many ways was more reliable because they didn't naively jettison the symbolic narrative language. And I think more modernists got lost because they didn't appreciate, it'd be like if you're trying to make your way through the wilderness. Say, I don't need that map. That
Yeah.
map is not the wilderness. No, it isn't. But it's going to be really helpful for orienting you to get through an actual wilderness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's, this is interesting because this has been one of the things that I've been working with for a while is, I, it first showed up in that dialectic with Jordan and Jonathan and John. At least that was the first I heard of it, where, John is insisting that narrative is not the fundamental ontology. And so, like, at first it just kind of bothered me, and then slowly I started to work with it. And as I've worked with it more and more, I don't know, like, I think all this territory gets very tricky because it depends on which side you're speaking from, right? If I'm speaking from the side of like me in my particular mind making sense of the world, that's one side. And then there's the other side, which is kind of the transcendent reality that we're pointing to. But we're talking about how to orient them or orient our relationship to them. So there's a weird paradox happening where it's like, okay, narrative is fundamental in this thing, right? Like if I don't have narrative when I'm working through my life, it's fundamental there. And in that way, well, no, I'll come to that argument later because this is an argument I want to make at the end of this. But then on the other side, there is some kind of transcendent thing that is real. And I know that at the end of the day, it's all okay because it has to be. And so you need a narrative that gives you that while you're still in the narrative. But when you're in the narrative, there's and you perceive that as being fundamental, you almost are forced into some utopic, or you're almost forced into some utopic slip. There's a little slip there where it's like, as soon as Jesus is actually coming back when things get really bad, like there's a slippery slope. So it has to be like, I think John's point in this last conversation with Jonathan was really important to say that I don't think that, I'm not trying to do away with narrative by any means. I'm just trying to say that, and I think really the argument he's making here is like, you're not the center of the universe in your egocentric state. Really, when you make this shift in your head, you notice how your life is being lived and it's constrained to a certain space, and you're constrained by forces you can't understand. You do have agency in it. You are a real agent, but it's all more complicated than you can know. So just do your best and be in it. And so I think that is where I've gone with that problem. And it's led me to this point where I think, like, I want to make the argument that Christianity as the story of Christ and this whole thing is like the completion of the narrative, such that you can drop out of the narrative, but you don't have problems with it, right? Because there's all kinds of other traditions that drop you out of the narrative, right? Like Buddhism, you drop out of the narrative. There's all kinds of ways to drop out of the narrative, but none of them like bottom out the narrative in itself, right? Like the claim that Jesus becomes incarnated and actually dies and actually rises again. It's like, it bottoms the whole thing. So for me, I guess Christianity has become a non-narrative narrative. It's a narrative that finishes the narrative and allows me to engage with reality in a non-narrative way.
Think about, so your 10-month-old boy or girl?
Girl.
Girl, okay. I bet you cannot look at your daughter and not construct a narrative. Now, that narrative isn't terribly present to you, but if I were to ask you, what's your daughter going to be like at 3? What's she going to be like at 5? What's she going to be doing when she's 7? I mean, you're just going to, there's a narrative back there. It's pretty fuzzy. It's pretty implicit, but it's all in there.
Absolutely.
That narrative will not happen as you think it will. I've got 5 kids. They're all in their, one's in his 30s. All the rest are in their 20s. I can promise you that, but you can't help but have that narrative.
Yes.
And that narrative is very useful for you, but it's much more like a big sheet of a big map that you're always editing. And there'll be points when something happens and that narrative gets violated and you will mourn or lament. And sometimes that narrative gets violated and you'll celebrate. And your wife is in there too, and the kid and parents and friends. I mean, there's a whole world around it. And I think it's helpful to think in those terms, that the narrative is inescapable. It's just simply too deep in you. This is an operating system that you are using, and it's going to be flexible. And I think if we think in those terms, when we think about Christian eschatology, that's super helpful, because of course Christian eschatology is one of these areas that there is by no means agreement on in the church. There's the dispensationalism, there's the, pre-mill, post-mill, a-mill. I mean, there's all these different schemas. And there's no agreement in the church on this, but narrative itself, I think it's inescapable. Now, how you handle that narrative with respect to your relationship with your daughter, it's pretty darn important, because there's going to be some opponent processing in your relationship with that narrative. There's going to be times as a father that you insist on this narrative with your daughter, and there's going to be discipline. There's going to be tears. There's going to be all kinds of drama in play, because you're going to be like, these are things you do and these are things you don't do. There's going to be other times when you're going to have to give way. Your narrative's going to have to yield to all sorts of other things, and you're going to be right there in the middle, adjusting the whole time. And I don't know that that is tremendously different from our relationship with narrative with our lives moving forward in Christ, because again, back to where we started, thinking about our relationship with Christ in relational terms more necessarily than in theoretical terms helps, and that's when you begin to realize the dynamic nature of the mapping and unmapping.
Yeah, I think I agree with you for everything on this side. For me, that I don't know how to say exactly how there's something else for me too. There's something else for me, because there's a level of my experience at which it's the kind of level that I've only touched through meditation and kind of like mystical kind of experiences. But
you have that with your daughter too, right? You come into her room. She's 10 months old now, so she's probably starting to stand up in the crib, right?
10 weeks.
10 weeks. Oh, 10 weeks.
Yeah. Sorry,
you're just getting started in the mystical relationship between, especially the mother's ahead of you, because she, you might have felt a little rubbing on the belly, but she's way ahead of you in this. But you are going to also have non-narrative mystical experiences as a father.
Mm-hmm.
there are going to be moments of
I've had a couple
transcendence.
already. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Just
And
like there was a moment, like there was this moment where I was actually kind of out of my own way, and I was like, I had her there and she was just staring into my eyes, and like,
yep, yep.
and I was, I have all this stuff about agape and all this stuff that I'm trying to like embody and participate in that moment. And it was a very, very profound experience. But
Yeah.
it was
And
the
it's not
kind of,
narrative. No, I get your point.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And now, but then you're going to have, then your narrative and your non-narrative are going to be in conversation with each other,
Yep.
because you're going to desire more of those non-narrative moments. A birthday party is, in a sense, the interchange between the narrative and the non-narrative.
Sure.
You're using the narrative to set up a non-narrative, which is, the celebration of her, giving her that, and Americans often do, giving her a big piece of cake or something on her first birthday, and gets it all over.
Yep. 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 Yeah. Well, I think I've enjoyed this a lot, and I'm not sure if now feels like an appropriate time to end it for you. I'm kind of feeling
Oh,
satisfied.
that's okay by me. That's okay by me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. Any final things you want to say, or?
No, it's a delight. I love doing this, and I haven't watched too many of your videos, but you know how YouTube is. You start watching a few, and they keep serving up more, and so I've caught some of it, and I just want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing and keep climbing that mountain, and keep thinking and sharing and thinking in public and thinking with others, and yeah, continue to enjoy your marriage and your child. I mean, I am I am dumbfounded by our culture, where people so quickly are dismissive of one of the most challenging and potentially joyful things that, I mean, people want to travel and go visit other countries, and it's like, if you have a child, it's an adventure like you can't imagine, and it's a lifelong adventure. So, but I was, when I was young, I was too dumb to know that. I didn't know.
Yeah.
And now that, and now my kids are young adults, and we just had the holidays, and boy, there's nothing like having the kids home for the holidays, and hoping that soon there'll be some weddings, and then at some point, I mean, it's one of the great gifts of human life. It's one of the most challenging, but so congratulations, and yeah, pursue it. That's a whole nother mountain in of itself.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you, first of all, and appreciate the encouragement. And yeah, it's I've so far I've been attempting to take the role of fatherhood as seriously as I can, from the perspective of trying to understand just what's going on, and it's been quite a roller coaster. So
Yeah, yeah.
thank you for the encouragement. I appreciate you.
Wonderful.
All right, all the best.
All right.